Imagine a weapon so potent, a force so tremendous that it could bring a whole nation to its senses without firing a single shot, without costing a life, at least outside the boycotted nation.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, right after the First World War, saw this idea of absolute isolation, the ultimate threat of sanctions.
They're really compelling image, almost utopian, you could say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the paradox, and it's a big one. Today, we often talk about sanctions as, well, an alternative to war, right?
Yeah.
A way to apply pressure without bloodshed.
Yeah, the non-military option.
But for so many people back then, in that interwar period, it was the total opposite. They didn't see sanctions as preventing war. They saw them as, like, the essence of total war. An instrument so brutal, some called it infinitely more terrible than actual fighting.
And that huge contrast, that fundamental shift in how people thought about it and used it, that's exactly what we're going to dig into today.
Right.
Our mission, really, is to unpack this fascinating and, often brutal history of how economic sanctions evolved, tracing them from this traditional wartime tool.
Like a blockade.
Exactly. A blockade, which was clearly an act of war, to something that was seen, at least for a while, as this sophisticated tool for peace, for international law.
Okay.
And we're drawing on a lot of stuff here, historical documents, research, and especially Nicholas Mulder's really foundational book, The Economic Weapon.
Ah, yes, that's a key source for this.
Definitely. It helps us get at the origins, the intentions, and frankly, some really surprising and often devastating consequences of using economic pressure. You'll see there are some real aha moments about the hidden costs and, well, the legacy it still has today.
Okay, so let's unpack this. How did this terrible remedy, as Wilson himself kind of called it, this weapon of mass deprivation, become such a central thing on the global stage?
Yeah.
How did it go from being just a military tactic, like you said, an act of war, to something people actually champion as a way to stop wars?
Yeah.
What was that journey?
Well, to really get it, we need to rewind a bit, back to before World War I, and look at what blockade actually meant back then.
Right, because it wasn't quite the same as how we might think of it now. It had a very specific legal and military meaning.
Absolutely. Historically, a blockade was, well, it was undeniably a belligerent act, no question. It was tied directly to a formal, declared state of war.
So you couldn't just do it whenever.
No, exactly. It wasn't like a light switch you could flip for lesser pressure. Think of it like besieging a city, but bigger, cordoning off coasts, islands, territories, cutting off all supplies. The goal was purely military. Starve them out, force surrender.
Very blunt.
Very blunt. There's that great quote from Jonathan Swift back in the 1720s where an officer basically scoffs that scholars with their nouns and his verbs wouldn't know what to do in a real siege or blockade.
Huh. Right. It emphasizes how practical and, well, dirty it was seen. Purely military stuff.
Precisely. It was about raw power, not subtle economics.
And so its use was strictly limited. It depended on an actual war being declared. And when the war ended, the blockade had to end too. That was the rule.
That was absolutely a rule. As soon as peace was signed, trade freedoms had to be restored immediately, unconditionally.
Okay.
It was part of this idea, this separationist theory, that commerce and war were, or at least should be, separate spheres.
Which seems kind of optimistic looking back.
Well, yeah, it was a very liberal ideal at the time. The thought was that economic ties, trade, would actually make war less likely, build interdependence, that commerce itself was a force for peace.
A novel idea back then.
Very much so. A real faith in international law and the power of trade to sort of rise above national squabbles.
Okay, so you have this hopeful idea that trade is separate, almost sacred.
Yeah.
But then something changes dramatically. This peaceful concept somehow twists into this brutal economic weapon. How does that happen?
Well, even before WWI really kicked off, you started seeing the seeds of this sanctionist idea growing out of the international arbitration movement.
Ah, the push for, like, world courts and peaceful dispute resolution.
Exactly. You had all these legal scholars, diplomats, pacifists, really hoping to end war by having countries submit their disputes to a neutral judge, but they hit a snag.
Which was?
How do you enforce the judge's decision? How do you make a country comply without sending in the army? How does a world court get teeth?
Right. Enforcement is key.
And so back in 1906, you had this French lawyer, Jacques Dumas, suggesting that maybe the sanction of bills would be more efficacious than the sanction of bullets?
Money over military might.
Basically, yeah. He and others started thinking about things like international boycotts, freezing foreign assets, cutting off credit as ways to enforce international law without resorting to violence. It was pretty revolutionary stuff for the time.
So the idea was already bubbling up, but then World War I explodes onto the scene, and I guess that just accelerated everything, maybe in ways they didn't expect.
Accelerated it massively and changed it fundamentally. The sheer scale of WWI, how long it dragged on, forced the Entente powers, Britain and France, mainly to, well, they had to, develop a system of economic surveillance and control without historical precedent.
Going way beyond just naval blockades.
Oh, way beyond. It became this incredibly complex, organized, truly transnational enterprise. They were aiming to master the entire global trading system,
Wow.
pouring resources into intelligence, mapping supply chains, figuring out financial networks, creating all these new policies to completely isolate Germany and its allies.
So the goal itself changed.
It shifted dramatically. It wasn't just about stopping the current war anymore. It was about using economic pressure as this powerful ongoing force to prevent future wars. And that really blurred the lines between wartime and peacetime actions in a way nobody had fully grasped before. The economy itself became a central battlefield.
And this is where it gets really confronting, doesn't it? The human cost. Because we think of sanctions now as maybe a less harmful option, but back then, they were brutally honest about the impact on civilians.
They were, and it's so crucial to remember this when we talk about sanctions today. Wilson himself, who championed this absolute isolation, also said that if war is barbarous, the boycott is an infinitely more terrible instrument of war.
That's dark.
It wasn't just talk, the reality was horrific. William Arnold Forster, a British guy who actually administered the blockade during the war, he admitted later, in really chilling terms.
What did he say?
He said, "We tried, just as the Germans tried, to make our enemies unwilling that their children should be born. We tried to bring about such a state of destitution that those children, if born at all, should be born dead."
My God, that's deliberate targeting of unborn children.
It's a calculated, horrifying intent to break the population's will through the most extreme suffering imaginable, not just stopping military supplies, but causing societal collapse.
So the idea was basically inflict so much pain on ordinary people that they'd force their own government to give up.
That was the raw logic, yes. Create unbearable internal pressure. But, and this is important, the original peacetime idea, the one for the League of Nations, wasn't necessarily to use it that way.
How so?
When they were designing it for the League, it was conceived more as a form of deterrence, almost like nuclear deterrence later in the Cold War.
You mean make it so scary nobody would dare trigger it?
Exactly. Spell out the potential horror of total economic collapse, hoping that would be enough to stop countries from challenging the post-war order. The threat itself was meant to be the weapon.
But the reality, even in the interwar years, was different.
Oh, yeah. When it was actually used, or even just threatened seriously, it cast this long-lasting socioeconomic and biological shadow. We're talking malnutrition, weakened mothers, higher infant mortality, stunted growth in children. Effects likened to radioactive fallout because they lasted for generations. And it's worth noting, feminist politicians and scholars at the time often saw this very clearly. They tended to oppose sanctions because of this impact on families and children, though some did reluctantly support them as, well, the lesser of two evils compared to outright war.
A terrible choice.
Absolutely. And Wilson, he also believed in the mental force of it all, the shame, the isolation. He talked about the still greater pinch that comes when a nation knows that it is sent to Coventry and despised. He thought that psychological pressure was maybe even more powerful than the physical lack of goods.
Wow. The shame factor.
Here.
That adds another layer. Okay, let's get practical. How did they actually do this? What did the machinery of economic war look like? The bureaucracy, the intelligence?
It was a huge, unprecedented effort, a new kind of government machinery. Take France, they were early movers. In March 1915, they set up the Committee for the Restriction of Enemy Commerce and Provisions, the Committee R.
Sounds ominous.
It was the nerve center. They put out 195 weekly reports on the Central Powers economies, vulnerabilities, supply lines, industry, all based on intelligence from their own dedicated unit, the SCE, which sifted through mail, telegrams, customs reports, everything. An economic spy agency, basically.
And the British. With their global trading empire, they must have had something similar.
Oh, absolutely. They created the Ministry of Blockade in February 1916, pulling together various existing bodies into one powerful ministry.
So both were building these machines. Do they operate the same way?
Not quite. There were interesting differences. The French, even with a smaller staff, just 53 people, remarkably including 26 women, which was quite something for the time.
Oh, yeah.
They were incredibly efficient and really pushed for vigorous economic pressure, even if it hurt the Entente financially in the short term. They saw it as essential for victory,
All in.
pretty much. The British, though, were often more cautious. They had this massive global commercial and financial network to protect.
Right. They had more to lose, economically speaking.
Yeah, exactly. So they were often torn between waging economic war and maintaining business as usual, trying not to completely disrupt the trade and finance that underpin their empire. A constant balancing act.
That makes sense. What are the neutral countries? Stuck in the middle, I imagine. They must have been squeezed.
Totally squeezed. The blockade planners quickly realized they needed the neutrals, even if reluctantly. Countries like the Netherlands, Switzerland, Scandinavia, they were key.
How did they manage that?
Intense diplomacy, lots of pressure. Look at the Netherlands. They couldn't just cut off Germany without violating neutrality and wrecking their own economy.
A tough spot.
So under immense Allied pressure, Dutch businessmen and bankers created this private body in late 1914, the Nederlandsche Overzee Trustmaatschappij, the NOT-T.
Okay.
Traders using the NOT basically promised that imported goods were only for Dutch consumption, not for re-export to Germany. It appeased the British, let the Dutch stay officially neutral, but
they lost economic freedom.
massively. They did something similar in Switzerland with the SSS. These neutral countries essentially had to curtail their country's economic sovereignty as a price for staying out of the largest war. It shows just how far the economic battlefield extended.
Incredible. And it wasn't just about physical goods moving around, was it? Controlling the money flow itself became critical. How did they manage that? The financial blockade.
That's right. Early on, the focus was goods, property. But then intelligence started showing these large money flows slipping through neutral countries, clearly financing trade with Germany.
The loophole.
A huge one. Like in early 1916, British Treasury intelligence tracked over $11 million in wire transfers from Wall Street to neutral European banks in just a couple of months. That scale of money could only mean one thing: ongoing business with the enemy.
So they needed to plug that financial leak. How?
Well, this British banker, E.F. Davies, he had the idea to bring in experienced traders from the City of London, guys who actually understood international finance, to spot the suspicious deals and build a system.
Makes sense. Use experts.
Davies argued pretty bluntly, it is better to lose money for 6 months and wage war successfully than to make money and endanger the empire.
Pragmatic.
And his view won out. From mid-1916, banks in Allied countries were basically forced to sign guarantees saying their accounts wouldn't help the enemy, directly or indirectly.
And if they didn't sign?
They faced blacklisting, prosecution, and forced closure. Serious threats. It was an unprecedented level of state control over private finance.
Wow. Did the government basically take over banking? Or was it more subtle?
It was a powerful intervention, but not quite a takeover. The Ministry of Blockade's finance section set up this rudimentary system of mandatory reporting. Certain banks had to report their weekly money flows to and from neutral countries with all the details.
Giving the government eyes everywhere.
Pretty much. Davies boasted they could follow every consignment of goods crossing the seas, which is financed in the United Kingdom, including the names of the consignors and consignees, ports, names of steamers, dates, the whole picture.
Incredible visibility.
But even with that insight, the actual day-to-day policing often fell back on the banks themselves. Private interests remained to a large degree masters of their own house, responsible for complying. The government sort of outsourced enforcement, using the threat of punishment to ensure self-policing.
A clever system in a way. Let's make this more concrete. Can you give us a really clear example of how these blockades hit a vital resource? I heard the story of German manganese dependency is quite telling.
Oh, it's a perfect case study. Germany was a world leader in steelmaking, right? Essential for the war effort.
Crucial, yeah.
But that strength relied on a huge vulnerability. They depended almost entirely on overseas manganese, which you need for high-quality steel, especially for weapons.
And where'd that manganese come from?
Before the war, about 90% of the world's supply came from two places: Georgia, part of the Russian Empire then, and British India.
Both controlled by the Allies or their partners during the war.
Exactly. So by 1916, Germany's main sources were just gone, cut off. They were left scrambling for tiny amounts from neutral Spain in a small mine in Austrian-controlled territory. Nowhere near enough.
A desperate situation. Could they get it overland? Was that an option?
Not really feasible, and that highlights another key point about global trade back then. Steamships had made ocean transport incredibly cheap.
Cheaper than trains, even for shorter distances.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Especially for bulk stuff like manganese. Getting Russian ore just 180 kilometers by rail to the Black Sea could triple its price because the railways were so bad.
Wow.
So German firms had actually found it cheaper to import from Brazil before the war because ocean freight was low and they'd invested in Brazilian railways.
Globalization, even then.
Absolutely. So by 1916, with 90% of global production in enemy hands, the blockade's impact was massive. It forced Germany into huge strategic shifts. They became obsessed with getting overland access to one region above all, Russia, driving their military goals in the east. It fundamentally shaped their war strategy.
So the economic weapon wasn't just theoretical. It had direct, tangible, strategic consequences, right down to the materials needed for war.
Absolutely. It forced nations to confront their deepest economic weaknesses in a way they never had before.
Okay, so the war ends, armistice, in November 1918. You'd assume the blockades stop immediately. Peace breaks out. Trade resumes. But no. The blockade continued for months. Why?
It's one of the really grim parts of the story. Yes, the blockade machinery stayed in place, keeping large parts of Europe in a chokehold of deprivation right up until July 1919.
Months after the fighting stopped. What was the situation like?
Just desperate. Reports describe Central Europe as so exhausted that it seemed to be consuming itself. Things like every clock in Prague gone, melted for the metals just to get basic industrial materials. Or children in Vienna dressed in suits neatly made from sacks because there was no cloth. Widespread hunger, disease. Immense suffering continued while the politicians debated peace terms in Paris.
And this was happening while they were literally creating the League of Nations, with its ideals of peace and cooperation. Seems like a massive contradiction.
It really highlights the harsh reality behind those ideals. The League's own Article 16, the bit that made economic sanctions its main enforcement tool, was being drafted while these blockades were still being used against Germany and also against Bolshevik Russia and the new Hungarian Soviet Republic.
So the context was immediate and brutal.
Very much so. Wilson and his legal advisor, David Hunter Miller, were pushing hard for sanctions to become a peacetime instrument, a real alternative to war. This was actually different from the British and French view, who maybe saw it more cautiously after just running a total economic war.
And Wilson had a specific goal in mind for Germany.
Yes, his vision was quite distinct. He explicitly linked commercial exclusion to the promotion of democratic government there. He hoped the economic pain would provoke them to assert their popular sovereignty, basically push the German people to overthrow the old regime and embrace democracy.
Using economic suffering for regime change.
That was the idea. Very different from the Franco-British focus, which was more about preventing future strategic threats and economic competition.
A fascinating, maybe slightly chilling objective. But given the suffering these blockades were causing, you mentioned reports of deep misery in Russia. How did policymakers justify this? Weren't there humanitarian concerns?
Oh, definitely. The humanitarian crisis was undeniable. The blockade of Russia during its civil war led to appeals from the Russian Red Cross for food and medicine. And within the Allied governments, some people were deeply troubled.
Like who?
Edward Wise, the British food controller, who knew scarcity firsthand, he argued, "I don't believe really that we shall kill Bolshevism by allowing children to starve or die for lack of drugs or medicine." He saw it as counterproductive, likely breeding more resentment.
Makes sense. But that view didn't win out.
Not entirely. You had figures like Robert Cecil, a key league proponent, but also a hardened administrator from the war and staunchly anti-Bolshevik. His response to Wise's plea was basically, "I see no other alternative."
Oof. Cold.
It shows a mindset where the political goal containing Bolshevism outweighed immediate humanitarian cost. The suffering was seen as a necessary evil. Even Herbert Hoover, famous for his relief work.
Yeah, the great humanitarian.
Paradoxically, even he wrote to Wilson arguing that it is a positively necessary fact that we have continuance of the embargo against Russia. He saw it as a tactical lever to force negotiations. For them, it was a tool to secure the peace terms and enforce Allied will, even if it meant prolonging misery.
A very pragmatic, maybe cynical view from today's perspective. Let's look at some early tests. What happened in Hungary in 1919 when they had that Soviet republic? How were sanctions used there?
That was a really early case of using this post-war. When Bela Kun declared the Hungarian Soviet Republic, the Allies, terrified of Bolshevism spreading, slapped on an economic blockade immediately.
Oh, without declaring war.
Exactly. That was the key thing. It highlighted this new legal vacuum. Traditionally, you needed a war for a blockade. Here, they just did it. And Hoover, again, played a role. He suggested lifting it briefly.
As a humanitarian gesture.
Not really. It was tactical. Lift it for 2 weeks, he said, to give moderates a chance to take over under better social and economic conditions. But the threat was explicit. If they didn't establish a non-communist government the Allies approved of, the blockade could be reimposed. Clear economic coercion for political ends, regime change via embargo.
And the Ruhr crisis in 1923, when France occupied German industrial areas.
That was different. The French occupation led to German passive resistance, but also strong criticism from German leaders like Chancellor Fehrenbach. He called the French actions nothing but acts of violence and deliberately linked them back to the trauma of the wartime blockade.
Invoking that memory.
Yes, telling the German people to show resilience against this new economic aggression. It showed how deeply the idea of economic suffering as foreign attack was now embedded in the German mindset.
So the memory was powerful. Did the threat of sanctions ever actually work in these early days? Like, did just threatening it achieve anything?
Sometimes, yes. The psychological leverage seemed quite potent. In 1921, there was a border clash between Yugoslavia and Albania. Things were escalating.
Yeah.
British Prime Minister Lloyd George just jumped in and threatened the League sanctions, specifically mentioning a Royal Navy blockade in the Adriatic. A very public, very credible threat.
Yeah.
And it worked. The fighting died down. Yugoslavia eventually pulled back. The public announcement alone created enough pressure for diplomacy to succeed. It showed the perceived power of just waving the sanctions stick.
Interesting. The threat itself could be enough. But what about when a major power just ignored the rules? Like Mussolini in the Corfu incident in 1923. That sounds like a big challenge for the League.
Corfu was a huge blow. An Italian general was killed on Greek soil. Mussolini used it as a pretext to bombard and occupy the Greek island of Corfu.
But did he declare war?
No, and that was his loophole. He argued it wasn't war under the League Covenant's definition, just reprisals, an older concept allowing force short of war. So Article 16 sanctions technically weren't triggered.
Clever, in a cynical way.
And he rubbed salt in the wound by citing past British and French actions, like the Allied blockade of Greece in 1916, as precedent. He basically threw the Allies' own unpleasant imperial past back in their faces.
Ouch.
It totally undercut the League's moral authority and showed how easily a powerful state could exploit legal definitions and historical hypocrisy to avoid consequences. The League couldn't really touch Italy. A major failure.
So the system was clearly flawed, vulnerable to power politics and legal loopholes. After these early struggles, wasn't there a big effort to make sanctions stronger, more automatic? The Geneva Protocol in 1924.
Yes, the Geneva Protocol was a really ambitious attempt to fix things. Drafted mainly by Edvard Beneš of Czechoslovakia and Nikolaos Politis of Greece, it aimed for an automatic sanctions procedure. Meaning, once the League identified an aggressor, sanctions would kick in almost immediately, without needing separate votes or consent from every state. It was designed to give the League real teeth fast.
What kind of sanctions were included?
Pretty much everything. Economic, financial, transport, communications bans, travel restrictions, but also, crucially, it included positive tools.
Like what?
Committing members to provide aid, raw materials and supplies of every kind, openings of credit, transport to the victim state. So punish the aggressor, but also actively help the one being attacked. Real collective security.
That sounds incredibly comprehensive. Why on earth did it fail?
Big resistance, mainly from Britain and the U.S. The British military establishment, the CID, worried it would tie their hands, forcing them into conflicts, especially potentially against the U.S. if they had to blockade American trade with someone else.
And the U.S. They weren't even in the League.
Exactly, but the U.S. rejected it too. Partly because of the domestic questions clause, they didn't want international bodies interfering in things like their immigration policies, especially regarding Japan.
Sovereignty concerns.
Big time. And the Monroe Doctrine fear of European powers enforcing League sanctions in Latin America. Beneš himself admitted that U.S. interventions in places like Mexico could have triggered the protocol, which Washington would never accept. These deep differences in foreign policy vision just killed it.
Fascinating. National interest trumping the global idea again. What about Germany? How did they fit into this League sanctions picture, given their blockade trauma?
Germany's situation was unique. Their foreign minister, Gustav Stresemann, was a pragmatist. He wanted Germany back in the international community via the League.
But he had conditions.
One huge condition for joining. Germany would not be required to participate in those sanctions, especially military ones or heavy economic ones,
Why?
because the Versailles Treaty had basically disarmed them. Stressman argued that joining an embargo without possessing an army was too dangerous for a country located in the heart of Europe. They couldn't afford to make enemies if they couldn't defend themselves.
Makes sense from their perspective. And the source mentioned a strange link to the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, it's a fascinating little historical footnote. Apparently, within German legal history, there was this concept of imperial execution from the Holy Roman Empire, where other states in the empire would collectively intervene against one member who broke the rules.
The kind of internal sanction system.
Exactly. So the idea of collective coercion wasn't entirely alien to German historical thought, even as they were trying to opt out of the League's version due to their current weakness. A surprising parallel.
Let's shift east to the Manchurian crisis in 1931.
Right.
Japan invades, but the economic pressure comes less from states and more from the Chinese people.
Through boycotts.
Yes, that was a really powerful example of grassroots economic resistance. After Japan invaded Manchuria, there were massive, widespread boycotts of Japanese goods across China. Not government-led, but spontaneous popular action.
And did they work? Remarkably well, actually. Japanese exports to Manchuria dropped by something like 68% almost overnight. Sales elsewhere in China tanked too. One American journalist called it a mighty economic weapon, a peculiarly fierce kind of war. It showed popular economic action could inflict real pain.
But that must have created headaches for international bodies, right?
Yeah.
Trying to deal with popular movements, not just governments.
Definitely. The big problem was that neither the Japanese nor the Chinese governments were unified actors. Japan had the civilian government versus the rogue Kwantung army in Manchuria. China had the nationalist government trying to manage this popular boycott movement.
Who do you even target?
Exactly. It complicated everything. And this crisis also saw a shift among some pacifists, like the American feminist Emily Balch. She moved from total opposition towards suggesting a voluntary private boycott of Japanese goods.
Why the shift?
She framed it as a way to exert pressure without resorting to a state-led hunger blockade, trying to avoid the mass suffering of WWI, but still do something. A move closer to the pro-League view, but still focused on avoiding hatred and civilian harm.
And how did the U.S. react? Still isolationist, but they were debating it. The Butler Committee report.
Yes, the Manchurian crisis really sparked debate in the U.S. The Butler Committee's Boycotts and Peace report in 1932 argued strongly for U.S. participation in international sanctions. They believed the threat of global economic isolation would deter any aggressor because business interests would just find it too costly.
The deterrence argument again.
Very much so. But it led to a big public clash. Raymond Buell argued sanctions were essential to stop war, and he insisted you couldn't separate people from their government if a population suffered from a boycott. They should just make their government behave.
Tough line.
Yeah. But John Dewey, the famous philosopher, was deeply skeptical. He doubted suffering would lead to compliance. It might just harden resistance. A fundamental disagreement about how economic pressure actually works on people and politics.
So by 1933, the debate is raging. Then Hitler comes to power in Germany, and everything gets much, much scarier. How did that change the sanctions discussion?
It brought a terrifying new reality. The Nazis' official boycott of Jewish businesses in April 1933, that was internal economic coercion, a chilling signal. British planners immediately started thinking about using economic pressure to stop German rearmament.
But could they use the League?
That was the problem. Rearmament violated Versailles, but it wasn't an attack on another country, so Article 16 didn't technically apply. Any pressure would have to be outside the League and without a state of war, which was legally messy and hard to enforce. The existing tools weren't designed for this.
So the framework was inadequate. What about the U.S.? Did they step up or pull back further?
They mostly pulled back into neutrality. In Congress, attempts to pass laws allowing targeted embargoes against aggressors got watered down. They ended up insisting that any embargo had to apply impartially to all belligerents.
So punish the victim too.
Effectively, yes. It turned embargoes from a potential weapon against aggression into just a general war avoidance tool. A big win for the neutralists, and it really undercut the League's whole concept. This led straight to the Neutrality Acts of the mid-30s. The U.S. chose to stay out.
Seems like a setback for sanctions. But then, unexpectedly, the Soviet Union joins the League in 1934. How did that change things?
It was a huge shift. Stalin and Litvinov, seeing the threats from Germany and Japan, did a U-turn on foreign policy and embraced collective security. The USSR joined the League Council.
And what do they bring to the table regarding sanctions?
A unique advantage. They're a government's trade monopoly. Unlike democracies where private business might resist an embargo, the Soviet state controlled all foreign trade. They could guarantee 100% in clients instantly,
Total control.
which significantly increased the leverage of any potential League sanctions. It added a powerful, unified economic player to the anti-aggression bloc. Ironically, a totalitarian state boosted the League's economic clout.
Okay. Which brings us to the ultimate test. The Italo-Ethiopian War in 1935. Mussolini invades, and the League actually imposes sanctions. This was the big one, right? The greatest experiment.
Absolutely. It was unprecedented. 52 out of 58 League members actually applied sanctions against Italy, a huge feat of international coordination. People at the time felt like it was world history in the making, real hope for collective security.
How did they plan to make it work? What was the strategy against Italy?
It was pretty well thought out, based on WWI lessons, but tailored to Italy. Two main angles. First, the British Admiralty saw Italy as a most favorable target.
Why?
Because Italy's industry depended heavily on imported food and raw materials, nearly half its coal, almost all its oil, and most of it came by sea. Their military was strong, but their economy was vulnerable. So a naval blockade of key commodities looked like the best bet to wear them down.
Okay. Naval interdiction, what was the other angle?
The Treasury focused on finance. Italy was short on foreign currency. They figured cutting off credit and foreign exchange would drain Italy's reserves in maybe 9 to 15 months, making it impossible to pay for the war. They even considered tricky moves like closing the Suez Canal or demanding cash tolls. A full economic squeeze.
Sounds like a solid plan, hitting Italy where it hurt.
Yeah.
But it didn't work out that way, did it? Instead of stopping aggression, it somehow fueled it, this autarky backlash.
This is the really crucial, tragic twist. The sanctions episode of 35-36 didn't deter Italy, Germany, or Japan. Instead, it terrified them and accelerated the search for economic autarky, resilience against sanctions, or a blockade.
Self-sufficiency became the goal.
Yes, and since none of them could truly be self-sufficient, the only way to guarantee access to resources immune from blockade was
Territorial conquest.
exactly. The fear of being strangled economically actually pushed them towards military expansion to grab the resources they needed. A completely vicious cycle.
Can you give specifics? How did Italy react after being sanctioned?
Mussolini launched his Piani Archici grand plans for self-sufficiency in food, coal, oil. Big national projects like coal mines in Sardinia, oil exploration in Albania, propaganda about Italy making its own war.
Did it work? Did they become self-sufficient?
Not really. Despite the effort, Italy never achieved self-sufficiency. Still needed lots of imported oil, for instance, but instead of backing down, this dependence pushed Mussolini further. He needed Spanish iron ore, Albanian oil, which helped drive him towards invading Albania in 1939. The sanctions reinforced his view that expansion was the only secure path.
Wow. So sanctions backfired spectacularly there. What about Germany? The Nazi response must have been even more intense.
Oh, absolutely. Blockade de Festigkeit, blockade resilience, became a core Nazi obsession, building on the WWI trauma. The Italy sanctions cemented their belief that Germany's survival depended on immunity from economic cutoff.
Turning defense into offense.
Precisely. It led directly to Hitler's four-year plan in 1936, which was all about achieving raw materials freedom through massive synthetic production, turning coal into oil and rubber, and exploiting domestic resources, plus politically driven trade with Eastern Europe.
And territorial expansion.
Directly linked. The annexations of Austria and Czechoslovakia were explicitly justified as necessary to grab resources, industry, farmland, to make Germany blockade-proof. Hitler himself directly referenced the Italian sanctions as proof Germany needed this Blockade de Festigkeit. It becomes central to his war planning.
A chilling example of unintended consequences fueling the path to war. So during this time, people talk about deglobalization. Was the world economy really shrinking?
It's a bit more nuanced than just deglobalization. Yes, trade volumes dipped in the early 30s, but for most of the decade, they were still actually above pre-WWI levels.
So what was changing?
It was more like a de-Europeanization of trade. Europe's massive share of global exports dropped significantly between 1913 and 1937. Other continents, the Americas, Asia, Africa, gained market share.
Why was that happening?
Countries outside Europe were industrializing, developing direct trade links with each other, bypassing the old European hubs. This made the world economy less centered on Europe, which in turn made the old idea of a Europe-focused blockade much harder to implement effectively.
Yeah.
Too many alternative routes and players.
Interesting shift. Back in the U.S., FDR starts moving away from strict neutrality. After the USS Panay incident in 1937, he talks about fighting without declaring war. What were these quarantines he mentioned?
Roosevelt was very deliberate with his language. He avoided sanctions because it sounded like League interventionism. Quarantine sounded different, almost medical. He said, "We want to be as smart as Japan and as Italy.
Yeah.
Do it in a modern way."
Meaning?
Meaning, fight an undeclared economic war against the fascist states, seen as a kind of global disease. His Treasury advisor called it waging peace, using aggressive economic tools to contain aggression without actually going to war. A big shift from U.S. neutrality, paving the way for later actions.
Waging peace. Powerful phrase. And that leads us to maybe the biggest shift of all. Lend-lease. Completely flipping the script from deprivation to aid. Why was this positive economic weapon so significant?
Lend-lease was pure strategic genius, born from crisis. By late 1940, Britain was nearly broke, couldn't pay for U.S. weapons.
Facing defeat.
Potentially. Roosevelt's solution was Lend-lease. The U.S. would lend guns, ships, planes on the condition they were returned or replaced after the war. It bypassed the Neutrality Act's cash requirements.
The arsenal of democracy.
Exactly. And it was positive because, unlike sanctions, it was about providing resources, not denying them. The core idea was the financial defense of state sovereignty against invasion, crucially, irrespective of domestic political arrangements.
So aid wasn't tied to whether a country was democratic.
Not at all. It was purely pragmatic, based on who was fighting the Axis. Monarchist Greece, nationalist China, authoritarian Turkey, communist Yugoslavia, they all got Lend-Lease aid because they were resisting aggression.
And the scale was enormous.
Massive. Over $48 billion by 1945, an unbelievable sum then. It allowed the U.S. to fuel the Allied war effort globally, while the manpower others, especially the Soviets and Chinese, did most of the heavy fighting. A hugely effective economic strategy for winning the war.
So economic warfare clearly continued and evolved right through WWII, even merging with bombing strategy. How did all this experience shape the design of the United Nations and its approach to sanctions?
WWII really cemented the idea of total economic war. Britain's Ministry of Economic Warfare didn't just do blockades, they fed economic intel to the Air Ministry for bombing targets. Bombing essentially became the accelerator of blockade.
A brutal synergy.
So when the UN was created from that wartime alliance aiming to prevent future wars, economic sanctions were put right back in the toolkit. The Dumbarton Oaks talks in 1944 revisited the League model, seeing sanctions as useful for both preventing and containing war.
Did they learn from the League's mistakes? Any key innovations in the UN Charter?
Yes, a big one was the two-tiered sanctions model, largely based on a Soviet suggestion. It created escalating steps.
How did that work?
You could start with economic pressure, maybe diplomatic breaks, then move up to severing all commercial and financial interaction, cutting off transport, communications, everything under Article 41. It offered flexibility, avoiding the League's all-or-nothing problem. And crucially, it formally established a distinction between uses of force that constituted war proper and forms of coercion that fell short of war. It gave a legal basis for coercive measures that weren't acts of war, that intermediate step between talk and fighting.
So quite a journey from a clear act of war, the blockade, evolving into this complex economic weapon. From Wilson's utopian peace tool to an instrument of total war's brutality, then refined again into this tiered UN system of deterrence and coercion. Looking back at this whole sweep of history, what's the main takeaway?
Well, the historical record seems pretty sobering, doesn't it? Most economic sanctions have not worked in achieving their political aims. The data suggests maybe only 1 in 3 uses was at least partially successful, and often with huge unintended costs.
So the track record isn't great.
Not really. The big challenge seems to be translating this technical skill, knowing how to cut off money or goods, into beneficial outcomes in the real world. There's this persistent gap between causing economic pain and getting the political change you want.
We know how the plumbing works, but not necessarily how to fix the house with it.
That's a good way to put it. We've mastered the plumbing of economic globalization, but the human factors, the weakening of wills, the nationalism, the orgy of hate sanctions can stir up. The self-destructive passions, those often derail the whole thing. Sanctions bump right up against the often irrational drivers of human conflict.
So what does this history mean for you listening right now? Because sanctions are still very much a go-to tool in international relations today. What does this past tell us about their real power, their hidden costs, and maybe their limits in our world? Think about that tension. The weapon is designed to create fear of falling living standards, but it often runs into something much harder to predict, that amor proprio, that national pride that makes people endure hardship rather than give in to outside pressure.
Yeah, and maybe the enduring legacy here isn't just about material impact. It's how this economic weapon constantly reveals the deep, sometimes uncomfortable connections in our global economy, and that never ending tension between the logic of commerce and the passions of conflict. It reminds us that however interconnected we get, the human element, pride, fear, nationalism, remains the ultimate unpredictable factor.